This episode of the Golf Guru Show is sponsored by enveedhemp.com. That's ENVEED hemp.com. I'm happy to say that Enveed has been my choice for my CBD needs for almost 3 years now, and I can't begin to tell you how it's improved my life. They come in 3 formulas: Clarity, Relief, and Relax. I typically take a Clarity drop in the morning with my coffee to get me focused and ready to go for the day. Some relief for my aches and pains or inflammation after a run or a workout. And then I do a drop of Relax before I go to bed that helps me get some of the best sleep that I've had in years. And my Whoop Band now tells me that it's definitely helping because my recovery scores have been higher than ever. Enveed Hemp CBD come in drops, roll-ons, and gummies, so you can take it however you choose. So go to enveedhemp.com and make sure you use the Guru code GURU20 for a 20% discount for life. You heard it right, 20% discount for life. CBD is a great supplement to keep you healthy and safe in these crazy times. So go get it. So let's get to today's episode.
It's not what you know, it's what you can prove.
You know how to cut to the core of me, Baxter. You're so wise. You're like a miniature Buddha covered in hair.
I want to become a guru so girls will like me. Then I will like myself.
Now, before we do this, let's go over the ground rules. Rule number 1, no touching of the hair or face.
Of course.
And that's it! Now let's do this!
What's up, everybody, and welcome to episode 131 of the Golf Guru Show. I am your host, Jason Sutton, and I am the Guru, where it's my mission to break down high performers in our teaching and coaching business, as well as people in all fields of study. Thank you so much for all your support of the podcast, and make sure you hit that purple subscribe button so you don't miss any of the future shows coming your way very, very soon. Well, you have all been asking for more technical teaching and coaching information with application, so all of you swing nerds out there are going to enjoy this one, as I am joined by 2019 Canadian National Teacher of the Year and one of the brightest coaches in our industry, Mr. Scott Cowx. Scott is the Director of Instruction at the Devil's Pulpit and also runs a couple of other academies in Hamilton, Ontario, where he's from. Aside from working with tour players like Mackenzie Hughes and a ton of great college and junior players, Scott is most recently known for sharing his information with his certification called the Anatomy Toolbox. If you've been following the show or heard me speak at seminars or on other podcasts, Scott's program is one that I mention the most, as it's had a massive influence on my coaching over the last 10 years. He has officially certified over 22,000 instructors over the world, all over the world, and has touched over 1 million other coaches and players indirectly, which I would say is quite a contribution to the teaching game and helping us all become better teachers of the game, which, as you know, is my passion as well. So I'm very excited to bring you part 2 with my good friend, Mr. Scott Cowx. Enjoy. Welcome back, man. Welcome back to the show. Mr. Cowx, set the scene. We're at the Carolinas PGA Teaching Summit / merchandise show. You were kind enough to come in and speak to the group, which was fantastic. We've spent a couple of days together, which has been nice. We don't get to spend enough time together. So I want to start kind of getting into it, right? So you've been on the show before. Everybody kind of knows your backstory. If you don't, then I don't go back and listen to the first episode. Exactly. Google me, as I always say, right? Yeah. Like you're no secret any longer. I probably mentioned your certification 100 times on this podcast because I really believe it's the best full swing certification out there, and appreciate what you've done for the industry, and we'll get into that. So my first question is how do you think we're doing as an industry from a coaching standpoint with education?
Well, I think, that's one of the challenges we all have is right, to stay current, to stay, let's say on the cutting edge. And, that takes a lot of work just to be able to do that. And, I think the network of coaches is really good. I think that we're in a time where coaches are more inclined to talk to each other, share ideas, share what's, best practices, if you will. Not only in terms of the teaching end of it, but also, let's say, the business side of it and some of those ideas. And that goes, within the PGA and also outside the PGA. And I think that we all have a respect, if you will, for each other and what we can do. And obviously, at the end of the day, we're all just trying to help people. So I think it's moving in the right directions. I think that the future will be much more collaborative in nature. So you'll have sort of almost teams of coaches, or you'll have sort of referrals where instead of a coach trying to wear so many hats, they will kind of specialize in certain areas, and they might open that up to, here's a great short game coach, or here's a mental coach I really trust, and kind of open up the doors to really hopefully helping the players with every aspect and not necessarily having to try and be a, jack of all trades.
Yeah, you see that a lot happening now, right? I mean, I think not for a long time, but definitely guys are reaching out, sort of creating teams. And I think it sort of takes the ego per se from our standpoint of like, I can't help them with everything. Let's get somebody. So it's about the player, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think if you put the player first and put the athlete first, good things obviously happen. And obviously we all have to make a living and do that as well. But I think that if we do a great job with the team aspect, I think we're all certainly capable of being busy enough. And, there's growth. There's a growth perspective, a growth potential here that I think we can get more players. And as we get more players, we're going to be even busier and obviously have opportunity for everybody.
Yeah. So if we sort of rewind the clock a little bit, not going all the way back into your backstory, but the last time we were together, probably one of the first certifications that you did as you were starting to get going with this thing was probably like 1 or 2.0, right? And you're up to like 7 right now, yeah. I think 7.0.
Yeah, 7.0.
Talk about how that's evolved and like any changes that I know there's been some changes in your where your home base is now and academies that you've created. So like catch everybody up on that situation.
Yeah, I think number one, I think that, the certification in particular will continue to evolve as language evolves, as, evidence-based instruction evolves, as we get better tools to measure things. We also have to stay current with that. So, 1.0, 7 years ago, the first time I did it in Denmark, had a lot of the same anatomy pieces, but at the time was in more golfing machine language. So we had accumulators and so on.
Right. I remember that from our
right.
First
and we I think even when we did yours, which would have been probably 3.0.
Right.
It was still kind of mostly in that language. So as time has gone by, we're talking much more, and let's say, we'll call it medically accepted language, if you want to call it that, where we've got things like radial and ulnar deviation and just more, obviously it's describing the same thing as golf instructors, but I think that more people will probably latch on to some of those ideas because it sort of mirrors what the medical industry does. And then from there, advances in ground reaction forces, hack motion. Now we have Sportsbox AI. We've got all these different tools that we can now use and will continue to evolve and use. So as a result, I think it's important to stay current. The 8.0, which I'm writing now,
yeah,
right?
I've heard.
Basically,
excited about that.
Yeah, it's going to take the patterns a step further, and really we're going to talk about the, call it the vectors of the joints and where they go in the different patterns. So, how does your elbow move relative to your spine, and et cetera, in the different patterns, and being able to sort of break it down into those aspects, because people have gone through the anatomy, which is great. But now we're talking about like very specific directions of things. And when we start to look at mathematical modeling of the golf swing, we start to look at things like the rate of squaring or the rate of overtaking of the club. That's where when you position the joints a certain way, you can manipulate those things. You can slow down rate of closure. You can slow down, rate of overtaking by changing the joint locations. So that's kind of where I'm going to take it. I guess that's the cool part is that I kind of look at it and go, hey, what would I like to know? And then, do a ton of research and study and everything else, and then, kind of release it out there. And that's the other thing too, is certainly all the information that's been presented, if I find over time, it's like, hey, you know what, I'm not quite really comfortable with the way I described that, or I might not be 100% sure of something. And that's okay. And it's just like, okay, well, I'm going to take it out, or I'm going to change it a little bit to, maybe fit my thoughts in 2022, which are different than my thoughts back in 2016.
Right.
So I think it's, I think people appreciate that. And
yeah, we all evolve, right?
Right.
And you got to always, you're always taking a fine tooth comb look at your information.
Sure.
And, running it through the database and going, all right, does this still make sense to me, right? And I think that's, appreciative of guys like me that are trying to learn more.
Well, no, to be honest with you, every time I presented, I learn more myself. I probably ask more questions about the material. I want to be as sure as you can be, certainly. But as we uncover different ways of measuring things, just like when we started to measure golf balls and we measured impact and we got TrackMan, all of a sudden it's like, really? Like, this is actually what happens? And, yeah. we've been sort of living a dream world where the path was, starting the ball on the line, as opposed to the face. And anyway, so we get things like that happen, that all of a sudden it might be a bit of a paradigm shift, and now we're thinking about things a little bit differently. And, at the end of the day, it's just, if we can simplify some of the difficult questions, and we can kind of get people to, the coaches in particular, kind of challenge themselves each day and say, hey, let's look at it a little bit differently than maybe my preferences say. And maybe we can be a little bit more effective as coaches by learning different styles or learning different ways of looking at the same problem.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. It's like, is there a process that you go through, or maybe a time of reflection? Maybe it's the end of the year, or at the end of so many seminars, or so many times that you do the presentation, where you go and take a deep dive. And it's tough for us, I think, is being self-aware of, like, because we're going to believe what we believe, right? Is there any kind of thing you could share or any process, I guess, or any tools or tricks? Because I think it applies to all of our life, but it also, for sure, with how we conduct ourselves as golf professionals, teaching professionals.
Well, I think number one, anybody that says they have all the answers is lying, for number one.
Right.
Nobody has all the answers, and we're all searching a little bit in terms of getting better at our craft and being more effective communicators, or being more. And it doesn't negate what you did before. It doesn't mean what you did before was poor. It's just, we're trying to find best practices and just be a little bit more efficient, or a little bit better at maybe getting some of the same things that you did 20 years ago, mm-hmm. which took a month, and now you can do it in a week and a half. So those things I think are important. And then, I think, to answer your question, I think obviously in Canada we get some bad weather, so you've got a little bit of time to maybe reflect in maybe November, December a little bit, and kind of think about things. And I think about things all the time.
Yeah, it's kind of a constant.
It is.
It's like breathing, right? To
right.
You, that's trying to do better.
And the areas that I want to look at, are obviously, I'm feeding that into the certifications as well, and maybe influencing a little bit of how people think, which maybe is a good and bad thing. But
sure,
I think it does help maybe coaches think a little bit outside their normal box, if you will, and maybe look at problems a little bit differently. And I certainly know for my own teaching, when I started to get much more into the anatomy side of it, that's where things really, really took off. And really, I started to understand the macro of the golf swing as opposed to just the micro, and didn't get lost in the micro so much.
Right. So let's start with anatomy.
Sure.
Right. So we talk a lot about that here. You talk about that's sort of how you start the process of when you look at a golf swing. How do you assess a player? Are there any screens or go-tos, or how does that look like, in your world when you're like looking at a golf swing, you're starting with a new student, like what does that beginning point look like to the outside world, I guess,
right, yeah.
Obviously I'm asking a big question and getting into your mind, but that's the cool thing about this podcast is like, what are you looking at from your perspective?
Yeah, I think first of all, I'm looking at it first from the macro. I'm looking at the player saying, okay, how does this player move? in general. Are they moving? We'll call it in an athletic way. Are they moving?
But is that more? And I have to interrupt. But I heard you say that today in the presentation. It's like, okay, is that more of a look, or is there some things that you really specifically look at and go, all right, sequencing, yeah. Right, okay, yeah. So
continue. So definitely, are they can they sequence, right? And are they let's say using the ground first? Are they able to interact with the ground well? Are they able to obviously have some efficient, let's say powerful movements, but also be smooth in those movements?
Mm-hmm.
Call it Louis Oosthuizen versus Greg Norman, in terms of, let's say, stylistic elements. So I'm probably looking at that first, and like a lot of things, I think a lot of times it's just you're looking at it and you're absorbing these things subconsciously. I wouldn't say necessarily there's a glaring order of things that goes on, but the more I've examined it, certainly that would be my first thing, is how do they move, how is their sequencing, and then from there I'm going to start to look at how are they delivering the club, maybe what they want, what they don't want, starting to look at maybe a little bit more of the micro parts, if you will. At that point, then I'm going to examine what's their setup like, what's their initial fundamentals like, and then from there start to maybe create a little bit of a game plan based on our talk together. Usually with most players, we're trying to do some sort of physical assessment if we can. Like we talked about before, most of my clients are on a sort of a long-term plan, 1 month, 3 months, 6 month.
Right.
I really don't do many sort of single lessons anymore. So that gives me the opportunity to sort of integrate some. If I don't do it myself, I've got a great referral list of chiropractors and PTs and things like that can give me some feedback on the body. Very, very nicely. But a lot of times it's looking at pelvic to thoracic mobility is a big one for me.
As they're swinging though, right? You're not doing limited segmental tests per se.
I may do some of that after, but okay. Yeah, exactly.
But you're just evaluating as they're moving and hitting the golf ball.
Is a player capable of separating pelvis from thorax dynamically in the golf swing?
Right. Because
that's a huge limiter in terms of what you decide to go from a pattern perspective. So if they can't separate those things, then that's going to lead to, maybe 5 or 6 different patterns as opposed to 13 that I maybe would teach. So if they can do that, then they've got more options, in terms of hand path, in terms of where they go at the top of the swing, etc. So that would be something I'm definitely looking for. The other thing I want to see is length of bicep. I want to see how thick and wide their chest is relative to how their arms naturally hang. Do they hang internally? Do they hang externally? How is their grip being attached? What are the upper arm elements as they hold the grip, right? So these are all things that I'm going to be looking for when they set up. And then some players might have some what we would normally call maybe bad fundamentals, but they move so well,
right,
that they make it all work, and you kind of go, "Wow, that was pretty good, actually."
Function over form,
right? Yeah. So also being able to curb those things and go, "Okay, I'm not going to jump in and change this just willy nilly, and for the sake of changing it, it's like, okay, what are the areas that are really going to influence this?" And I would say my general overview for the majority of players is I'm going to be absolutely as minimalistic as I can be to obviously get the change that we're looking for. So if I can do it with setup, if I can do it with some early backswing kind of pieces, I'm going to try and spend my time there. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the downswing if I can influence it, much earlier on. So
yeah. So you kind of go body to hands, arms, and then club,
right? And
then sort of figure out what's influencing what.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things. I mean, obviously the golf swing is so complex because you've got, things that you're doing to the club, things that the club's doing back on you, and be able to balance that.
Yeah.
And some players can't handle forces, right, in a good way. So sometimes you've got to make adjustments based on that kind of piece if they can't sort of handle some of those forces. So, takeaway's huge, to decide whether it's a planar or non-planar swing. That would be the next thing. Looking at it and saying, is this player, I'm looking at their swing, are they sort of Adam Scott where they're going up and down the same lines, or
I was going to say, define that. I mean, it sounds like planar is more like not a huge plane shift. Would that be fair?
Yeah,
as
correct.
Far as like
so
golf machine terms, and then
let's call it P2 to 4 to 6 is pretty.
The sweet spot's moving in a reasonably same area,
similar pathway as the hands are traveling, right?
Right.
So that would be my definition of planar. Now, planar mechanics are great. They're really good for players that want to hit lots of shots, because then I can just bend the hand path and hit fades and bend it the other way and hit draws. But because the club's following that hand path, it becomes reasonably easy to sort of predict from a path perspective what's going to happen. Then you got non-planar swings, like your Victor Hovland, like your, Matthew Wolff would be an extreme version of that.
Big plane shifts.
Big plane shifts.
Yeah.
Very different mechanics. So now you're looking at hand paths traveling in a very different direction than the club path in the early transition. And then you're using that leverage, if you will, at the bottom of the swing to really curve that hand path quite aggressively. So there's some speed option there. I think there's a little bit of potential for sort of late leverage and speed, or passive torques, if you want to use that terminology. We can maybe hit a little bit further. Generally, those players tend to hit one shot really, really well, I would say. It might be a little bit harder because the plane shifts to hit draws and fades, but they tend to drive it, particularly well with some sufficient speed. So,
yeah, it's always an interesting decision when you see that type of pattern where, sort of like an old Ricky where, club goes really, or like a Ryan Moore goes back really steep, kind of comes down shallow. It's like, all right, well, maybe I would prefer to see the hand path a little bit more in, or the lead arm a little lower. And it's like you take a chance on getting them too far under, right? Yeah. Or it's, it's like you don't know, if that transition is going to change, or is it going to stay the same and start creating a bigger problem.
Well, there's some interesting things, too, just from a club awareness. So when you have a plane shift, what ends up happening is you're changing, because of the shift in the club head, or sorry, the shaft pitch, what ends up happening is you feel a sudden change in your hand. So there's an awareness that you build by being non-planar. If it goes back, let's say, a little bit steep and then shallows out, there's a definite change within the hand. And as a result, once you kind of feel where that club is, because it changes, there might be some advantage in terms of kind of sensing where the golf club is, or sensing where that sweet spot is, versus a planar swing. If it goes up and down the same lines, we don't have those changes within the hand. It actually might be harder to feel the club face.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's an interesting... it's an interesting conundrum, if you will. And then there are some players that, would certainly fall between those two patterns.
Right.
Would be subtle shifts, if you will. But I would look at that next. Are they planar, non-planar mechanics? What am I trying to do with that? And then from there, we're trying to take into that player's feels. We're trying to take in, what their preference is in terms of ball flight. The better the player you work with, certainly it's not about the flight they want. It's about the flight they don't want. And
take away the big miss that they
kind
hate,
of push them them away from their big miss shot, and they're quite happy most of the time when it's like that.
Yeah. So a couple of things that I thought were interesting today from the presentation. You talked about preference versus substance, and then anecdotal instruction versus evidence-based instruction.
Right.
So elaborate a little bit on that, and then we'll kind of get into some details.
Yeah, I mean, basically preference versus substance was more from the coaching side of it, and saying, we're so used to maybe looking at swings in a certain lens and saying, okay, I like this because, I like the look of it, or whatever it happens to be, versus, hey, let's make the best decision based on the student, based on the functionality, right? If they can, if they've got a crazy plane shift and they're Jim Furyk and they've got Jim Furyk's face-to-path numbers, you got to be stupid to change that golf swing, right? So it's one of those things where we have to be careful not to jump ahead of ourselves and say, okay, well, I'm going to put my stamp on you because I like to see a planar swing. I'm going to teach you a planar swing, as opposed to saying, show me what you can do. And then maybe what are the things that we can't do? And then from there, let's make some decisions together on where we go with that direction. So that's kind of the preference versus substance. In this day and age, obviously, we have a lot of kind of, we live in a Kardashian world was the quote I use, and there's a look that people kind of are chasing a little bit, and that's fine. There's some functionality pieces to some of those looks, but also it might be so far different. Maybe your anatomy can't really handle that. So we need to have better options based on our anatomy. And then we start talking about evidence-based versus anecdotal teaching. Basically, that would be TrackMan, we could say, is evidence-based, saying, hey, here's the thing I'm going to get you to do. If I really know my patterns well, this is what I'm going to see on your TrackMan values.
Club delivery is going to be such.
This is how your club delivery is going to change.
Yeah.
And, you know, as a coach, when you can pull that out and basically, you know, look a little bit like a prophet and say, wow, yeah, you absolutely moved my path 5 degrees here with that one little thing.
Right.
You know, that certainly builds some trust and some confidence in the coach. But anecdotal would be more, you know, what does it feel like to the player? And you know, the better the player you work with, I think it's important to take into their effect how they like to be around the golf ball, what they like the feel of, and maybe what they hate the feel of around the golf ball, and take those things into consideration as well. And because at the end of the day, it's only you and your feels when you go out and play.
That was one of the questions that I really had thought about a long time ago. As you told me the Eduardo story, and one of the things that you wish you would have changed. And I was going to ask you, like, how much does the player's input or preference do you take into account, right? Because they can be influenced by Instagram looks as well, right? It's like it's kind of like the Tiger story, right? It's like he just won the Masters by 12, 15 shots, and then he's like, I don't like the look of my golf swing. Like, talk a little bit about that. It's such a tough line that we have to walk as far as when do we change something, when we not change something. Are we listening to our student, especially the good players, right? Because they can, like Tiger's clearly done well with 4 or 5 different patterns.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think that, you know, when you look at, you know, developing good direction, if you will, with your students, it takes some time, you know, and it takes some time just to listen to the player. And I've gotten to the point lately, you know, sort of the last 5 years where, you know, if they're a tour player, they're a really, really good player, I want to listen to them talk about their swing and about what it feels like. And even before I kind of make any comments, I want to know, like you said, you know, maybe they worked with somebody else. I need to know maybe their back history a little bit. I need to know maybe what they've been watching on Instagram or YouTube a little bit, and say, you know, what do you think is a good swing, and kind of ask them that. And
it's a great question.
You know, when you ask that question, you sort of, they start to think about themselves and go, yeah, you know, I kind of like Louis Oosthuizen or whatever it happens to be. And it's like, okay, well, why do you like Louis Oosthuizen? You know, it's like, oh, he's got beautiful rhythm. I say, okay, that's usable. Who else do you like, right? And so together you end up sort of creating a bit of a game plan. Obviously, there's probably some mechanical issues, or else they wouldn't be there in front of you. So that's kind of the easy part. It's more about designing the, you know, we'll call it the car. We're designing the delivery of that message to them in the right way that kind of hits all the pieces in terms of, okay, I like the way it looks, I like the way it feels, the ball flight's the way I want it to be. Okay, this is fantastic.
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, there's also some players who go, I don't care what it looks like.
Yeah, you get the other side of the spectrum, right? Those are the kind of the ones you sort of like.
Right,
because
absolutely.
they just want the ball to do what they want it to do.
Right. They're like, I don't care. Just give me a ball flight I can handle and make sure it doesn't hook or whatever, and I can go out there and shoot 65. And those players are fun too, because they're less obsessed with maybe the details, and they're just looking at it saying, just give me something that I can work with.
Right.
So it's an interesting problem, as you said. I think it's a tough one for all of us to sort of balance. You know, there's lots of coaches out there that create really good looking swings, but at the end of the day, you know, we also need to create champions, and you know, there's also great coaches that build a lot of champions that you would say, hey, that guy's kind of got a funky swing.
Yeah, it's like I'm always curious of the mindset of the coach. You know, we always said, you know, Jim Furyk's dad should have been National Teacher of the Year, right? For not like changing a lot of stuff that we probably would have changed early on, maybe.
Yeah.
But it's like how, I don't know. The other question, and I have asked plenty of coaches, this is when you're testing a player like that during like an initial analysis, like how many shots do you have to see to go, damn, that's funky, but that's really, really repeatable and that's good, you know?
Right.
I don't know the answer to that completely, but you kind of, I think it's probably on a case by case basis.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times I'll try and play with them, or even drive around with them while they play.
There you go. You see them on the course,
yeah,
right? That'd be the ultimate.
I want to see what they're doing out there primarily, and then we can kind of talk about it afterwards. If I've just got a range session with them, it'll be kind of like, okay, hit some shots for me. Show me that you can hit it high and low and left
Ask them
to right.
to work it a little bit, see what happens.
What shots are you comfortable with? What shots are you not comfortable with? Kind of put them through a little mini combine, if you will.
Right.
And then from there, you can, kind of assess it. And the better, we talked about the 3 boxes today, right? Mm-hmm. So to be a tour player, you've got a technique box, you've got a skill box, and you've got a access of those skill sets under pressure box. And each one of those boxes needs work. You need to spend a certain amount of time, developing technique and improving your technique. And then there's a certain part of time that you need to be just hitting shots and, learning how to hit knockdowns and fades and draws and all the rest. And there's a certain amount of time you got to work on your breathing, your hydration, your food intake, all those things that you're going to use in a golf tournament to hopefully keep a reasonably even keel and being able to access those skill sets that you already own under pressure. And depends. I mean, I think there's awesome coaches out there that do 1 or 2 of those boxes really well.
Yeah.
And there's a few really spectacular coaches that do all 3 pretty well. And I think that sometimes players get lost in one of those boxes, usually a technique box. And, that sometimes they don't spend enough time working on the skill sets or, more importantly, how do I access those skill sets?
Yeah, so just kind of going down my list here, right? And we can go in so many different directions. I had a bunch of notes and then took more today as we... Even the time we spent together just having drinks or having dinner is super valuable with your insights. So one of the things that came to mind is sort of the odd swings that work, right? And Victor Hovland kind of comes to mind, right? And we talked a little bit about it earlier. And I know you've mentioned that measuring his rate of closure, he's like the lowest rate of closure of the club face. Talk about his pattern, because I think you described it pretty well today when we were talking about Cobra pattern.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about why his swing works, and then obviously we're going to get into wrist angles and some other cool stuff, but just let's start it off with that.
Yeah, I mean, Victor's an interesting case. Had the chance to meet up with Victor back when he was in Norway, when I was over there a few years ago doing some work for a club called Miklagard in Norway, just north of Oslo, and Victor's a member there. And so I got actually to meet Victor and kind of watch him hit balls for a little bit. And, even back then, I think this is his first or second year at OSU. And, his stripe show back then too. And just hit the ball really straight. And I remember, the club face being pretty shut, pretty right. Closed, if you will. And but this thing came down and, hit it pretty much on a string most of the time. And, Victor's had some influences. He's worked, a little bit, I think, at different times with Dana, mm-hmm. Online. He's learned some things from other coaches online. He was working with a coach that was heavily into the Calvin Miyahira stuff. So he's had some different influences. But from all that, Cobra pattern was really pushing that wrist toward flexion, getting that face very, right. very closed. And then basically on the way down, Victor, as he shallows the club out, the face is opening. So the face is actually kind of opening at the wrist level as he pivots. So that's kind of how he's able to call it working the club closed to open, if you wanted to use those right. terminologies. But he's basically rotating his body, and at the same time, the face is almost opening, if you will, at the wrist level. But he kind of balances it out with the contribution of his pivot, right? To kind of 100%.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to be able to move, and you got to be able to move really quick
mm-hmm.
To make all that work. And I think that his work with Jeff Smith. Jeff's, I think, just kind of maybe cleaned up a couple of things there and worked on a short game a little bit. And he's obviously the full package. He's a top 5 player in the world now, but he's incredibly talented as a ball striker. And we're going to see more swings that are non-planar like Victor Hovland because, like I said, I think there's some advantage from the passive torques. There's some advantage from being able to curve the hand path like that and be able to control that rate of closure. And I think John Sinclair was the guy that measured it at 675 degrees per second or something.
Right.
Sasha McKenzie, I think if you put a club in your belly button and were just to rotate, the number something like 1,200 degrees per second.
Yeah, I saw Sasha shared with me his swing on his software.
Yeah.
And was telling me, I mean, I didn't understand the numbers, but I was like, that's pretty low, pretty crazy. Like, I mean, average golfer would hit it miles to the right.
Sure.
Probably with that pattern, right?
Right. Well, you've got to get it so closed, if you will, to make it work in the backswing.
Right.
And you know, he's got a lot of flexion like a DJ, like a Morikawa, like a John Rahm.
Yeah.
And then from there, you know, he's really, really pivoting hard. And like a lot of those players, if you look at how his lead arm actually chicken wings a little bit post-impact, and that's because he's holding that radial bone open. So these players that get super flexion aren't really able to supinate their forearms. I mean, that would be death if he did.
Right.
So he's almost counter-rotating in the forearms to make up for the fact that the club face was so close.
See if you can describe, I know it's a podcast, but what you talked about with the upper arm positioning for that pattern, how important that was, and then how it was moving, for that player.
Basically, you've got two main styles of release that you'll see tour players use. You've got, we'll call it your classic turn down, Tommy Fleetwood, Tiger Woods kind of release pattern, where the player is actually starting with their lead arm, upper arm's internally rotated, radial bone or forearm is internally rotated, and then they're externally rotating that whole package together to a certain extent at impact. So they start internal, and then they rotate a little bit more neutral, so it impact sort of the center of the bicep, the radial bone on the lead side. They're kind of all on top at impact, even though they started 20 to 30 degrees internally rotated. When we look at Cobra patterns, the total opposite. So players like DJ, players like Victor start with that lead arm quite externally rotated, and then actually it rotates internally on the way down. So it's literally moving 180 degree opposite to the wrist option A player like Tiger Woods. So that's really where it gets interesting in terms of using that as a squaring mechanism, or in Victor or DJ's case, slowing down, if you will, that squaring mechanism just by altering the position of that lead arm.
Yeah, and that can kind of lead us into the different wrist angle release patterns. Right, so that was, I guess we call option A. Yeah.
Well, option A was
flexion. Let's say club's extension towards flexion model.
Yeah, so that's your classic.
That's classic
turn down.
So go through those patterns, because it was fun. It kind of, and I would share this because I had a lesson last week that was sort of an aha moment for me, where I had a player that was kind of your classic, club player, rolls the face open a bit at 2, gets really extended at 4, club face is pretty open, and then he tosses it out coming down, gets, super wide, right, no lag at all. And I was like, all right, we need to change your wrist down. His grip was fine, like it was sort of neutral-ish, and I changed his wrist angles at the top, but then he started actually flexing super hard at like from 1 to 2, and it almost like maxed out his range of motion. So from there, then he went back to extending more.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like, so we had more success with like not letting him flex early, but flexing more late, and then actually flexing more in the downstroke. Does that make sense? It was weird.
No, 100%.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they're, like we said a few minutes ago, in terms of there's forces that you're putting on the club, there's forces the club's putting back on you, and when you get that center of mass of the club kicking out and back around the hand path, it is bending your wrists. It is changing those wrist angles. So sometimes when you push the wrist too far toward flexion early, then as you said, the club kind of has no other response but to go back into extension later on.
So it kind of reminds me of that pattern where if DJ and Morikawa are flexing more at the top, that they actually are coming down and extending more late.
Right.
So describe that a little bit, because I think it's helpful for the students to say, just because you see good players on TV with bowed wrists, that doesn't mean that's going to help you all the time.
Right. No, 100%. And it's when, So
yeah, exactly. That's a great point.
You've got DJ who's starting that process early. You've got Morikawa who's, Victor who's starting that process early. And then you've got players like Morikawa and so on who are doing it more at the top of the swing.
Right.
John Rahm does it at the top of the swing. So Certainly there's options to be had there, but I think, the two basic styles that we see on tour, there's about 4 normal kind of wrist release patterns that we see tour players use, and of those 4, there's probably 70 to 80% are those two. So the turn down, keeping the lead wrist reasonably, flat, if you will, throughout the whole swing, or having a consistent value there in the back of the lead wrist. And then they're building flexion as they come down. So they start to flex it maybe around halfway down. They sort of kind of increase that toward impact, and they create their dynamic loft. They create their forward shaft lean by, let's say bowing the wrist slightly at impact. That would be kind of wrist option A. And then wrist option B is, let's push this thing way beyond what we're going to actually use in the swing and get kind of crazy with that left wrist flexion. And then we can allow the club head speed to actually pull some of that back out around impact. And that's what we see players like DJ and Koepka and Victor and Morikawa, amongst others, kind of utilizing the club in that manner. And that's why their finish looks different. That's why they're allowing that club head speed to work toward extension as opposed to roll or supination.
And that's where they also have to have the body rotation and side bend to match
100%.
and keep the club moving into the ground, right? So I think that's where, like, from our club players, a lot of times that's not the best option because they can't. We've shortened the radius and now they can't reach the ground because they can't side bend like that.
Yeah, 100%. I think there's some anatomy concerns there, just from a general length of bicep versus length of spine issue is a big one. But also, as you said, I mean, if we can't match up the rotations and side bend appropriately, then you kind of have to take that release style off the table. So generally, we'll call that a younger person's swing, if you will, but I do think you're going to see more of that as opposed to less of that because, like we talked about in the presentation today, those players generally don't go through a pattern of their development where they block it and hook it like most players who have become decent players usually have learned to draw the ball or hook the ball at some point. And you spend the rest of your career trying to sort of minimize it, if you will.
Do you find that those patterns tend to drive the ball better?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to get one of my big indicators is like handle height at impact, right? So which requires a ton of side bend and rotation for the better drivers like a DJ or a Tommy Fleetwood or guys that are top. And you look at the guys that are like at the bottom of the driving list, like a Phil Mickelson or Luke Donald back in the day, right? They're throwing it a little bit more, a little steeper, don't have the handle as low to the ground.
Yeah, I think there's some correlations there for sure, but I think, just as a general viewpoint, I would say the advantages with wrist option B would be in the long clubs. So driving it better, driving it higher, driving it straighter, maybe a little cut. 3-woods, way up in the air, right off the ground, little cut. Long iron's kind of the same way. The disadvantage with that wrist option is inside of maybe 50 yards. So if you try and do the same thing from inside 50 yards, there's an awful lot of negative bounce that you're presenting to the ground. So you don't have enough time in a 50-yard shot to reroute this and shallow it. So if it goes back really kind of closed, and that's why Victor kind of struggled a little bit with his chipping and his pitching, was, that he was trying to use the same wrist option they would use in the full swing on those little 20, 30-yard shots, and it just doesn't match up. So the wrist option A players tend to be better chippers, better pitchers, better because they're rotating the face a little bit, which is actually sustaining the bounce a little bit longer at the bottom, and then they're able to hit different trajectory shots, high, low, just by changing that amount of flexion in that lead wrist. They get very good with controlling and hitting different trajectories. So I would say if you want to be a great wedge player, probably a pretty good versatile iron player, wrist option A is definitely good. Not that obviously you can't drive the ball well with it. There's lots of players that certainly do. But I think that just if we're looking for a generalized statement, you would say that the long clubs might be a little easier with wrist option B.
Yeah, then wrist option C is sort of your down cock radial pattern, your Richard Young that you're working with. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I mean, we would have seen more of that. Call that
Cameron Champ.
Yeah, Cameron Champ, maybe a little Sergio. Somebody that really, really, kind of down cocks it or adds radial deviation. In the downswing portion of the swing. Which we were kind of taught maybe 30 years to do, but now it creates sort of negative attack angles and sort of a little bit of a challenge, creating sort of a shallow, wide bottom of the arc.
Yeah.
So
you got to give it back, right?
we're seeing less of that, I think, in trending, if you will, on tour. We're seeing less of those swings as time goes by. There's always going to be outliers. There's always going to be guys that hit the ball great with that too. Yeah. Like Richard hits it quite nicely. Obviously, Cameron can hit the ball really nicely too. So, but I think you're going to see more players like Rory, DJ, Justin Thomas. They're actually losing those angles fairly early in the downswing and creating a much shallower, wider arc at the bottom. They're able to drive the ball so much flatter and higher because of it. So their spin rates go down, launch angle goes up. So just from an efficiency standpoint, I think there's a lot of good things that come from that.
Yeah, I love the fact that spending time with you and going through the cert, talking about, almost radial. Like back in the day, I used to teach a lot of wrist hinge, and now I understand that it's not always advantageous for the player because we know that more radial deviation creates an open face, which could cause a lot of issues. So I've put so many, like just average golfers into that sort of underload pattern as a feel, probably more than anything, which keeps the face a bit more stable. So talk a little bit about how, why do you feel that way? And obviously Mac Hughes could kind of fall into that category, I would guess, with, a little less.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we've talked about certainly in the past, and when, he's actually 3 miles an hour faster when he underloads the wrist as opposed to overloading them. And it's just that.
So for the listeners out there, literally telling players not to hinge the club.
Right, yeah, just don't overload it. Like,
let the weight of the club do it rather than you physically trying to create more angle.
Yeah, to a point. I mean, somewhere around 90 degrees would be sufficient. I mean, we need some. Absolutely, we need some. But because of the golf ball, being less spinny these days, to launch the ball high and with little spin, if we're a little bit shallower, a little bit flatter there, it's a little bit easier to manage. So that CR underload or constant radius underload pattern, which is one of the prevalent patterns I do teach players, is just taking the wrist angles or the lag, if you want to call it, and we're just delagging them somewhat. Because as I said, if there's a lot of there's a party at the top, there's a party at the bottom, and so if there's a lot going on in transition where we're changing that, we're overloading that, creating a lot of extension in the opening club face, we're going to have to shut the pivot off pretty early to be able to kind of make it all work and square it up at the bottom. This way, we tend to see players actually be able to apply more linear force to the club and basically keep rotating, keep turning, keep jumping, doing all those good things to pump more and more energy into the club. So that's something that I think that the golf industry has gotten confused at. Was, for 100 years we've been telling people that, hey, to hit it far, you need as much lag as you can possibly manage. And what we're seeing instead is actually, no, that's not really a great way of doing it, because you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. Yeah. Right. You might see some potential from an angular output perspective, but if I have to slow my pivot massively down, it may not be worth it. I was reading something the other day, and it said, the average player, I think, on tour from P5.5 to impact was slowing down that lead arm about 2 to 2.5 miles an hour. But a player like Bryson, who is quite a bit underloaded, was actually only losing 0.5 mile an hour. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was really interesting, just to see how, hey, this player, because he's gotten those angles out earlier, if you will, doesn't need to slow down that lead arm. That's going to affect the overtaking rate, obviously. That's going to affect the closure rate. Right. So interesting when we start to think of sort of two ships passing in the night. You've got some players that are, rushing right up to P5.5 and then have to pull it all off to get those angles out. And then there's players that are much wider that kind of go, yeah, I don't really need to slow down. I can just keep accelerating. Mm-hmm. So some very different feels around the golf ball in terms of getting it all to work. So, teaching average golfers, right? And we discussed this a little bit at dinner and the last couple of days with players, maybe just a little older demo, asking for a friend. The errors, like talk about what you see as far as the common errors, and I can chime in on what I see
And then I want to like ask your opinion on why do you think some of these things happen, which would be the opposite of getting too much lag. I'm not seeing very few players I'm seeing getting too much lag, right? Aside from our really good players.
Right.
Like, what do you see as far as commonalities for average golfers?
Well, number one, by and large, the average golfer has never learned how to use their hands in a reasonable way. So
there you go.
Even when we look at supination rates or rotation rates in the forearms, okay, like the slowest rates that you'll ever see are in amateur players. Okay, they literally they literally don't have any supination at all.
Yeah.
And in fact, almost opposite.
Right.
They're almost pronating through impact. So that would be the first thing. So even the players like Victor Hovland, even like DJ, there's still supination happening. It's just much more, let's say, retarded, if you will, than wrist option A. But with amateur golfers, some of them literally have zero rotation or even counter rotation into the golf ball. So if we can teach players to maybe add a little bit of flexion, maybe add a little bit of supination, I'm a big believer that if we can start there with the average player, we can go a long way.
Love it. I love that so much.
Yeah, I mean, they're not going to be able to turn side bend and do the things like obviously some of the pros on TV. So we need to find a better way. And for them, it's about, hey, if I can control my hands well, understand what they need to do, understand how the amount of lead wrist flexion is going to be indicative of the loft that I'm going to put on the golf ball, and the supination is going to help me, open or close the face. And if I understand what that relationship's like, even at a very rudimentary level, we can hit some solid shots. And then it's just a matter of, okay, can I repeat this? Can I do it over and over again? And, so developing golfers, again, most of our golfers probably are not in the position where they're going to change their bodies completely and be able to maybe do some things that tour players do. So we need to be better at getting them to understand how to deliver that mostly with their hands and the arms.
Right.
And then have their bodies support those movements.
I love it. Yeah, tail wags the dog, right?
100%,
Old school.
100%.
Yeah.
And with those players, for sure.
Educated hands from golf machine, and then tail wags the dog.
Absolutely. And like we talked about in the presentation today, like I love going back in history and looking at stuff and saying, hey, these guys were pretty close. Like Hogan knew D-plane before D-plane ever existed.
Right.
He opened his stance on his short irons and he closed his stance on the driver because he realized, hey, the ball went straighter when I did that. So he just played with literally 14 different setups, and he was manipulating D-plane in 1950. So he just didn't call it that, obviously, but he kind of figured out, hey, ball goes straighter when I set my stance a little closed on the driver and when I open my stance on my wedges.
Shift the baseline.
Right, absolutely.
I love it.
Those kind of things kind of excite me because it's like, okay, we all want to take credit for, saving golf or whatever, but, they had it figured out back then. They just didn't talk about it the same way.
Yeah, we just have a way to measure it now and probably a little more accurate language. So we can shift into some ground reaction forces, and then I want to get back to a few trail arm mechanics, which I'm kind of obsessed with. You spoke today a little bit about, ground reaction forces and torques, obviously, how you create speed, which is a big topic now, obviously. I mean, we know it's important. So share a little bit about what we talked about at dinner as far as, you still got to find your golf ball. But then shift into maybe a couple of things that coaches could probably look for as far as maybe what you like to see with the lower body,
right? How
you teach pivot. If you're going, all right, here's our goal,
sure,
to create a bit more speed. Some of the things you see and some of the things you work on with your players.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly thanks to great scientists like Dr. Kwan and Dr. Duffy and Dr. Scott Lynn and obviously Sasha McKenzie and some of these great PhDs that are looking at golf now. I think we're probably better off understanding what's actually going on at the ground force level and being able to integrate that into the pattern as well. And one of the things I think for the average player that's listening, it's more important you hit the fairway, period. Right? Hit it straight first, and you can now, attack the hole from wherever you are in the fairway.
The Frankie story.
Right.
Like, talk about that. That was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so 4 years ago when Francesco Molinari won the British Open, he was in the top 10 in strokes gained driving, hitting the ball only 285 yards. Okay, because the metric is, the average PGA Tour player is about 60% in accuracy on fairways at about 296. So if you beat either one of those on tour, then you've technically got strokes gained. So Francesco Molinari was so far ahead on the accuracy, it was somewhere around 80% on his fairways hit that particular year at 285 yards. So he absolutely blew it out of the water from an accuracy standpoint, even though he was 10 yards shorter than PGA Tour average. So the average player should be looking more at that and say, hey, what can I do to hit more fairways? The other stat that's really interesting is 150-yard shot. PGA Tour average is 28 feet from the hole. From 100 yards, PGA Tour average out of the rough is 28 feet from the hole. So if you do hit it further, you better make sure you hit the fairway, because you literally have to hit it 50 yards further to have the same proximity to the hole. So if you hit it 10 yards further, 15 yards further, 20 yards further in the rough, your proximity is going to be larger than being back in 150 yards. Now, obviously, that's PGA Tour players, good players, whatever. But it's an interesting stat because everyone's looking at it purely from the distance end, saying, hey, how far can I hit this thing? And not really taking into account both Rory and Bryson, as they've tried to get longer in the last 15 months, have lost significant fairways. So the trade-off hasn't been worth it, and I think both of them have realized that a bit, and both of them are starting to scale back a little bit. Mm-hmm. So there is a threshold. I think 185, 190 ball speed is probably the max.
It's plenty, right?
Well,
to compete and win.
But I think anything beyond that, I think, becomes too penalizing on the misses. And at that point, you've now given up that advantage because your misses are now double bogeys. You're hitting it into places where, you're just not going to be able to recover. So I think, we'll find, unless courses stretch out to 8,000 yards and you've got 70-yard wide fairways, I really think that there's a threshold on the distance, and it's somewhere around maybe 185 to 190 at the top end. Yeah. But anyways, it's interesting. So when you look at it from a ground reaction force standpoint, I love the way Swing Catalyst does it and breaks into three forces. I like it how GASP plates work. Steve Gould at GASP was really good. So looking at the way we utilize the ground and maybe tap into maybe your natural movements a little bit better. Mm-hmm. I spent 2 days in California on the plates, and it was interesting because it had been a while since I was on the Swing Catalyst plates. And as a hockey player in Canada, growing up, we usually have strong laterals. We have those lateral forces are quite strong from playing hocky.
The linear?
Linear,
yeah,
sorry.
Like more towards the target movement.
So
okay, gotcha.
We'll call it horizontals if you want to call it that. Right. So those forces tend to be really, really strong in a lot of Canadians because we're used to skating, and there's a lot of that going on. Rotationally, I was okay. Vertical was pitiful. I basically had no verticals. And
it's tough to have all three, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you do, you're probably on tour. But I think it's it's one of those things where if you can balance them out, I think it's a good thing. So we played around with it, and it was interesting because as I improved my torques, Ryan Faust in Encinitas, we're working on some stuff, and as I improved my torques, improved the verticals. My club speed really didn't change that much. That was the interesting thing. The speed didn't really go up. Okay. But I played the next day and drove it brilliantly.
So the question is, what did you do? Specifically, you worked on stuff. What does that mean?
Right.
Do some drills? Yeah. What did, talk to us, from a teacher standpoint, what did that look like? Yeah, one of the things about being lateral or being horizontal mostly with the movements is my hips basically never stabilized. There was no braking force. There was no sort of abruptness where I was changing directions and releasing that energy into angular output. So basically I would keep sliding forward, sliding through the intersection would be a good way to describe that. Okay.
And that's kind of how my horizontals move. So I wasn't able to create very good braking forces. The timing of my movement was a little bit off. But one of the things that was really illuminating was actually looking at where my kneecap was going.
Which one?
So my lead kneecap, generally, and would move too far laterally. So it would move too far outside my foot. My hip would go with it, but from that position, I really couldn't create the braking force, really couldn't create any verticals from that position. So it's like doing a deadlift or doing a squat, one-legged squat with my knee hanging out the side. It's just not very powerful.
Hopefully you can get that visual, like the listeners, because he's basically saying that the lead knee needed to stop. You need to start pushing up and back, right?
Right, big time.
Start creating more rotational force,
right? So
you don't keep sliding through the gate.
Right.
Yeah.
So we talk about it, GASP calls it AP forces, or, basically horizontal torques, if you will, or we'll call it in swing catalyst language, we'll call it torque. But basically because of where my left kneecap was going, I couldn't actually engage the ground properly.
Sure.
So Ryan was great, gave me a couple of drills to work on. And
what were those drills?
So basically a really easy one. Basically put an alignment rod behind my heels.
Okay.
And coming down, first of all, I had to load it properly. So I had to increase my hip turn quite substantially more than I was. I had to feel more pressure actually get a little bit into my big toe on the left foot at the top of my swing.
Interesting.
So it was interesting.
Okay.
So I had very little pressure in my big toe at the top of the swing. So we tried to increase the pressure so that then on the way down I would actually push away from that.
There you go.
And as I pushed away from that, the goal was to make my foot jump over the stick. So my foot had to jump over the stick.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, Dr. Kwan would call that running backwards.
Right, or the rainbow move, whatever you want to call that, right? And I mean, I remember, let's say 2-3 years ago when some of the long drive guys were obviously using this rainbow move, and I'm like, I can't even figure out how to do it, I like physically, but where my kneecap wasn't going to allow me to do it. So anyways, long story short, I've got some homework to do, and I'm excited because, for sure, I went out 2 days later and played at San Diego Country Club. I think I missed one fairway.
And you were just thinking about just that?
100%.
That was like kind of your swing thought feel?
Yeah. At a couple fields, in my swing, I was like, all right, this is a fun round. And
right.
Pretty relaxed round. So let's go ahead and have some fun, and actually drove the ball, very, very, very well. I know I can get stronger with the movements and hit it further, but it was just incredibly repeatable, if you will, with the accuracy. Which for me, anybody that's played with me, when I play well, I drive it well. When I play poorly, I drive it poorly. Period. That's the deciding factor of whether I shoot under par or whether I shoot over par. And on this particular day, went out there, hit it beautifully, hit the stick on an approach shot, made 4 birdies. It was a good day.
That's cool.
All I was thinking about at the time was just repositioning my kneecap, and by keeping the kneecap a little bit more in, that actually forced me to internally rotate on my lead hip. That's something I probably have never done in my entire golf swing career, is actually start my downswing into internal rotation in my lead hip.
Oh.
Never.
That's gold right there.
I have never done that.
Right? So that's the whole, just sort of letting the pressure shift, keeping the hips sort of, that be described as keeping the hips more closed to the target.
A little bit.
Longer a little bit, right? Which would help shallow the club, which kind of leads into like what probably average golfers need to feel more of.
Yeah, I was always under the Sam Snead impression of that I was trying to create the big wide house, so both legs pushing external. Right, that would be the model, if you will, at least in my own golf swing that I had worked on certainly in the past.
That's awesome.
And suddenly to change that and be internal on that lead hip was a whole bunch of new feels. But it definitely engaged, it engaged some different muscles, and from there I felt like for once I could kind of feel that left leg working, my lead leg working. And so anyways, kudos to Ryan for helping me out with that for sure. But, being able to measure those ground reaction forces and being able to make very accurate decisions based on that. And obviously, I'm not playing a ton of tournament golf right now. So, I mean, for me to tinker and play around with it was kind of fun. I wasn't even better that I went out there and actually hit it pretty nicely, considering that was the second round in 5 months.
That's really cool. Yeah, it's like that. That makes me like one of my favorite sort of feels or drills to get somebody to shallow it out. Like going back to sort of the original premise is some of the most prevalent things we see in our average golfers, our club players, is obviously, you know, a very leftward path, losing angles in the in the downswing, overtaking, you know, with the club head, a lot of lead wrist extension, super early, low point moves backwards. You know, these are just typical things we see. So I'm always real interested in how you would teach. One, what do you think causes that the most? And this is a broad, obviously, spectrum of a question, but also because my idea of that is the trail arm is moving the wrong direction, or it's straightening too early, or the trail shoulder is moving, you know, in the sort of, I guess it'd be more internal. From 4.5 to 5, and I'm seeing I call it tipping out, where the crossover of the CG and the handle gets too early, and club face closes. You talked about, you know, we're training wrist angles. Is such a bad question, but I'm just brain dumping at this point, breaking all my rules. So club face closes. We add loft, right? Even though we may have a decent club path or swing direction,
right? Like
we got a mess at the bottom, right?
Yeah.
How do you train that? What are some of the drills you use to fix that?
Yeah, number one, I think number one we have to get across, especially the average golfers, is concept and understanding that the arc that the club is approaching that golf ball is way more severely inside than they think it is, right? So conceptually, they're trying to move that club in a straight line. So they're trying to line it up 3 feet before the golf ball in a straight line and somehow hold this angle, if you will, through impact. So I think there's a conceptual problem, number one. So they've got to learn how to, you know, let's say, bring it from the inside, if you will. So, you know, a good drill would be cross-handed, you know, a lot of cross-handed swings.
Yeah.
Cross-handed feeling some supination is going to give them the feel of keeping that sweet spot back, you know, or behind the hand path longer. Yes. You know, ideally, if it kicks out at P6.3, that would be about the right time.
Okay. I was going to ask that. What do you like to see? I'm talking a camera angle that's on the hand line,
right?
Which is what I use. I'm looking where that club head, the sweet spot, crosses over the hand path.
Yeah, basically P6.3, so after last parallel.
Gotcha.
But it's still got to be early enough, because if it's later than that, often the player's either going to have to bend the hand path like crazy late, or, you know, they're just going to get kind of stuck in underneath it. So,
gotcha.
You know, those players that tip it out early and it happens P6 or even before P6, you know, at that point they're dead, because if they keep rotating, they're just going to go miles left.
Right. So
they shut off their pivot, and then they, as you said, they'll scoop their wrist or do whatever to try and save it. Or if you're a good player, you tilt back at that point.
So what do you think, aside from concept, like physically, technically, what do you see causing that as a model, I guess?
Well, I think backswing. You know, I would say
face being too open.
Yeah,
or maybe
loading order going back. They get flat and open going back. So as a result, they start to change the pitch of the shaft in transition. They start to kick it out early, because that's their mechanism. Because they don't know how to supinate.
Yeah.
If they kick it out early, they can somehow get this face to come around.
Or shank it. One of the two.
Or shank it, right. And so, you know, that's where we start to get into like clown's nose pattern. We start to get that clown's nose on top, and we start to get the orientation of the center of mass.
Explain that. That's a fantastic segue there. Yeah. Explain what that means,
So easy way to teach that is just to take, you know, a clothespin and a clown's nose, put it roughly 6 inches above the hosel, so it's in line with the lead edge of the club. And that basically represents where the club's overall center of mass is. And, you know, basically in the swing, if we can take that back and have the clown's nose slightly rotated toward the target line, or we'll call it closed, if you will, going back. And then as they hinge it, they've got to learn how to keep it in that relationship. And that's the point where most people spin the shaft open and they rotate that clown's nose the other way. Now at the top of the swing, face gets open and maybe laid off. And then from there, they're not going to shallow it any more than that and open it even more. They're going to go the other way. So they're going to steepen it, try and feel that steepening is actually closing that club face again. And at that point, they end up in trouble. So if they take it back a little bit close with the clown's nose facing the target line, and then they learn to hinge so the clown's nose kind of points back at your nose. So for those of you out there, if you take it to, chest height with your lead arm and you look back at the club face, a good reference would be pointing back at your face. And that's a nice little reference there. And if it is, it's going to be, we'll call that, lack of a better term, we'll call that neutral. And then to the top of the swing, you're going to try and keep that relationship intact so that you don't change the wrist angles, you don't change the orientations. We just kind of turn and bring that up to the top. And then when you come down, the club will actually naturally shallow out very nicely for you. So the CG of the club or the clown's nose is going to be sitting on top of the shaft a little bit more at P5, and then you can just kind of rotate through the bottom really cleanly. So it's a very easy way. One of my favorite ways, especially if you've got a group of golfers, in a room together, is you can teach them some great club and center of mass sort of relationships with a silly little clown's nose and a clothespin.
Yeah, it's super cool. One of the interesting things today, we were talking about wrist angle options, and sort of Bryson was like an outlier as far as something you hadn't seen. Like, talk about, like, go through that scenario. It was pretty wild. I'd never seen his wrist angle data.
I mean, most players are starting with the lead wrist in about 30 degrees of extension ballpark.
Right.
Okay.
Like hack motion, like hack data, right?
Measuring this on hack motion. Yeah. But you'd even see this on AMM or any other good system that's reading wrists. And, Bryson starts 10 degrees in flexion. So he is 40 degrees different with where that lead wrist is. His wrist is
super weak
position, but it's actually bowed, if you will, at setup. And from there, then he cranks it wide open and rotates the face open and extends the wrist to get some radial deviation or some hinge out of it.
Right.
And then at impact, he's got to screw it the other way. So he's going to push it toward flexion, add a ton of supination. And that's when you watch Bryson take practice swings with the irons, you'll see him finish very much what we call up the wall and kind of that release pattern. And so very, very unique pattern. Literally in the database, when I first started looking at the hack motion data, that was bizarre. I mean, that was so far different than everybody else in the database, basically. But obviously hits the ball great. So
do you think this would be just an observation of, like, one of my big things too, to like change path or to give players more time to shallow it out? Like, he's a bit across the line now, right, at the top, or crossed up.
Yeah.
Does that help him being a bit more open and extended at the top to sort of close it? Like, thinking the opposite, if he made that move in the backstroke with a weak grip and opening the face and he was laid off, I would think that would be difficult for him to manage.
Yeah,
something Chris and him maybe have worked on. I have no clue. Like, I'm sure they're all exploring all that stuff.
Definitely his work with Mike Shy, and building the swing. That swing is definitely evolved into something else. That swing would have been, the old swing was very planar. Spent an awful lot of time with the robot, making swings on the robot, as well as kind of the explainer idea. Really getting a very planar golf swing built, and certainly as he's been chasing the long drive, he's definitely now non-planar, and as you said, he gets the club across the line now, and he's doing some different things. So there is a shallowing effect in Bryson's swing, and like you said, he almost has to push it toward ulnar deviation right away in the downswing, where he's basically delagging himself, and to help him be able to square it up,
stable at the face,
right?
because he's in range of motion, like you said. That's his whole deal. Has to be substituted with something,
right? And then from there, obviously getting that back to an impact position where he feels like the left wrist doesn't break down. Now, in reality, with the driver, it is breaking down, a little bit, but he's able to sort of stave that off to a certain extent with the irons, and he's a very, very for as far as he hits it, it's remarkable how straight he does really hit it.
Yeah. And how good his wedge play's gotten too, because of some of those pieces, I guess.
Yeah, I think for him, it's just fitting the equipment and some of the things with the single length clubs and everything else. There's some difficulties maybe there, and I think he's figured out the equipment end of it a little bit more so than maybe a couple of years ago, but. Yeah, I love watching him. I love. I think he brings a certain brand of, interest, if you will, to the game.
Yeah.
As a coach, makes us kind of rethink things maybe a little bit, because he is a little bit out of the box on a lot of things he's done. But, he has accomplished what he's set out to do. He said, listen, I'm going to get big. I'm going to get heavy. I'm going to be 210-mile-an-hour ball speed. And everyone's going, no chance, no
Right.
chance. And, a couple of the guys at TXG were down in Arizona at the Cobra Day that they did in Scottsdale when Bryson hit 220-mile-an-hour ball speed.
Wow.
I mean, that's absurd for a tour player.
His feet's are going all over the place, right? Everybody's like,
yeah.
"Oh, you got to stick the finish." I'm like, no. Like Berkshire steps out of every shot.
Sure. And
right. So he's learned a lot from Kyle, I think.
I mean, I'd love to see him pull out 220 ball speed on a hole on the PGA Tour.
That would be so cool.
I don't even know if he would ever do that, but I mean, obviously having that in your back pocket, and knowing that your gamer is 202, and your hard one's 210, really remarkable. So I mean, to his credit, I mean he's backed it up, as much as people were maybe saying, hey, there's no way you can accomplish that. To his credit, he's figured it out, and a lot of work, and maybe there's a little bit of injury involved now. Maybe he's pushed himself a little too hard, but
right.
It's fascinating to watch, and
it is.
He's
backed off a bit, right? So he's now come back, like we were talking about. He's come back a little bit, and then obviously getting hurt was kind of the only thing I thought could slow him down.
Yeah.
So I'm sure he'll figure it out. I mean,
I'd love to see him,
recover.
I'd love to see him win another major. I mean, if he won the Masters or something like that, I think it would be a real change for him. And, obviously he's spent probably the last 2 years really working on it, and really this last year seen some incredible things. But at the same time, it hasn't really translated to wins.
Yeah.
And obviously out there, you're measured by, your career is measured by your wins. So he needs to win more. And, I think he's made that a weapon, and now it's like, okay, let's get back to business, and let's get back to the chipping and the wedges and all the rest of that stuff, and improve those areas. And because it is, it's certainly fun to watch. And I mean, we're coming up on Bay Hill again. Is he going to drive the green again on the par 5, number 6 again? Or put it up by the green again? And I mean, now he's even longer. I don't even think it's a question now.
No, it's not even close.
If the wind, if the wind's not into his face, I think he goes at the green every day.
So one thing I knew that I learned about you was you spent time with Mo Norman.
Yeah.
Talk about that time you spent with him, what you learned from him, and some of the. You gave him a few lessons, or
no? He gave me lessons.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say okay. I was like, I don't know that we really give that guy lessons, right? It's
no.
But always love to hear stories about Mo.
Yeah, so Mo, basically where I grew up in London, Ontario, was about 45 minutes away from Mo in Kitchener, Ontario. And when I went to work I worked at a municipal track in a little town called Brantford, which was only about half an hour from Kingston. So Mo was always hanging around, and he'd just show up randomly, and he'd want to hit balls, or he'd want to just talk or whatever. And there were guys, and it was amazing because he gave me 2 lessons in the late 90s, and the first lesson was basically about footwork. And kind of talked about what he did. He felt like he had a piece of gum stuck on the inside of his right heel, and at impact he just tried to squeeze that heel into the ground as hard as he could. And when you look at that, I mean, a lot of the stuff that I got from Mo I didn't understand until years later.
Sure.
What he was getting at, because the way he would describe it was different and so on. But basically that was containing the amount of lateral movement in the hips. That was containing the amount of rotation. You could kind of get to a certain point, but that was it. And that was the platform that I really believe was the reason Mo Norman was Mo Norman.
He had a pretty wide stance, right?
Wide stance, set the feet, and then by putting that piece of gum against the ground, basically, locked it into position, if you will.
Banked his right foot.
And then from there, that gave the platform for his arms and his wrists and everything to deliver the club. And then the second lesson I got to Mo, I was playing a mini tour event, and the mini tour had actually, it's called the Mo Norman Cup. So, it was like the FedEx Cup, I guess, on the mini tour circuit. But basically, Mo Norman, his name was on the trophy and everything else. So he used to go to all the events and say hi to all the guys. And we're playing this course, and it had rained like crazy the night before, and the range was closed. So you got 100 and some odd, you got 100 pros or whatever, and they can't hit balls. And Mo taps me on the shoulder. He goes, come here. And so we walk over around the side of the range. He goes, you get a golf ball. I said, okay, I'm going to listen to you, Mo. And he gets a golf ball. He says, okay, stand right here. And you see that tree, it's 20 feet away. He said, stand like a golf shot and hold that ball in your right hand. Now throw it against the tree. So I throw the ball at the tree. And I miss the tree, right? And he goes, I see, you pulled it, right? And then he says, try it again. So I pick up another ball, and I throw it, and I move it right out of the tree, right? And, about the third one, I start pegging off the tree, and then I start grooving this. I start hitting off the tree. He goes, you don't have to hit balls.
Goldilocks drill.
Yeah, you don't have to hit balls, right? Yeah, basically triangulation, right?
Yeah.
And anyway, so when I studied that, and a couple weeks later, I'm on V1 or whatever, and I go, okay, let me see this drill, right? And right forearm's dead on the plane.
Yeah.
Right, but I mean, Mo didn't talk in those terms.
Sure.
He just said, throw the ball against a tree. Anyway, so I went out that day, and I may love to say I won, but I didn't win or anything. But I played pretty good. Shot under par that day, and hit the ball pretty nicely, and didn't hit a range ball before the round. And so those are the two lessons I kind of got from Mo, and yeah, I mean he again, one of the issues we have with golf is language, right? So sometimes it was tough to understand what he was getting at, but most of his stuff was absolute gold.
That's awesome. So what's the future of golf instruction look like, right? You mentioned a few interesting things we've been talking about for several years, but I found it real interesting, and I want to go into your little field study about the grip. So talk to us about that. This is new stuff, I think, to me or to a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, the next TrackMan is going to be an instrumented grip that we teach with. So basically, you would hold this thing, and this thing is measuring the forces that you're putting into the grip. And by putting that into good players, we'll be able to see exactly how they're putting forces into different parts of the grip at different times in the swing. And all this is happening certainly in the downswing in a quarter of a second. So it's tough. And right now, 2006, Dr. Koike in Japan built one for $1.1 million. So it's very expensive. Dr. Kwan went to Japan a year and a half ago or so to see Dr. Koike, and they're trying to build a second one. So the technology is coming, and when it becomes cost effective, when let's say it's $10,000 or something like that, you'll be able to first of all catalog, hey, here's when you're swinging really good, this is how you apply the forces to the handle, and be able to measure all of that. And with sounds really spooky, but when you start getting players to understand how to input forces into the handle, there's a certain level of consistency. So like Sasho does, you've seen many times in his deals, where he'll take the club and he'll flip his hands upside down and go, okay, well, if I put the forces into the grip the same way, I can still make this look like a golf swing, even though my hands are literally 180 degrees flipped in terms of their orientations. And that's where it gets really interesting, because as much as we're talking about anatomy and so on in my certifications and stuff, in reality, when you change the anatomy, you're changing the inputs of the forces. So that's where it's super, super cool. So, you'll have some biofeedback, you'll get some nice little lights or some nice noise when you do it right, and when you do it wrong, it'll tell you the error and tell you what you have to do. So it will streamline teaching very, very, very quickly. You'll be able to get players who really have no concept of how to move the club, even from a very early developmental stage, to be able to learn how to put these forces into the golf club in an efficient way. So you think of juniors doing that from 5 years old, 8 years old, 10 years old, right from day one, learning how to put forces efficiently into the golf club. Mm. So, I mean,
way ahead of the curve, right?
Way ahead of the curve.
Yeah, he talked about how a lot of the stuff is going to be, I mean, obviously when we have measuring devices, it's allowing us to get to the solution quicker. Like, it's almost going to build patterns for us to, like, have more I don't know how you described it, but it was more like, all right, it's going to give you not the answer, but it's going to give you the limited options of like, oh, this is where the player needs to go based on what we're measuring.
Right. And basically, like we said in the presentation, changing anecdotal teaching toward evidence-based.
Yeah.
And saying,
here's the evidence.
Here's the evidence. Hey, I'm producing more speed, or my face-to-path relationship is more consistent when I do it this way. And really, helping the player actually self-organize themselves to build their own fundamentals. Mm-hmm. So then we're out of this picture of saying, this is what it has to look like to be a good player. And we're saying, no, there's lots of ways that this can look, but at the handle perspective, this is how you do it, and this is how good players are doing it. So you said you'll be able to put in an Adam Scott's hand or Rory McIlroy's hand and say, okay, hit 2 shots for me, and literally have all the answers in terms of the forces applied to the club.
That's crazy.
So it's already here. It's just a matter of
it's like, can we afford it? Start mass producing it or whatever.
Right.
Make it less than $1 million.
Yeah, I mean, I think by the time it gets to $10,000 or $20,000, I mean that literally could be the next TrackMan.
Yeah, talk about AI a little bit. I think that's going to be like the next frontier for us as golf instructors.
Well, we machine learning is and not just in our industry, but in all sorts of different industries, and having AI and artificial intelligence actually learning movements in golf and learning to track, Sportsbox AI, who, I'm kind of getting involved with a little bit with some of their stuff, is their AI basically takes 48 markers across the body and it's tracking it in real time and being able to give us some very accurate feedback on where the body angles are and things like that. And we take that further, we're going to get kinematic sequence data, we're going to get wrist data, we're going to get club data, and eventually even ground reaction force data.
So you get the whole deal.
The whole deal.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, we're talking crazy, crazy stuff from a 2D video. And, there's a lot of very advanced, let's say, calculations and so on that have to happen where probably a human being can't do it. So that's where... as we feed the machine more swings, if you will. I mean, it sounds very matrixy for sure, but as we feed the machine more swings, it is learning more. Yeah. And it's learning to recognize things. So when we start to look at club fitting, we start to look at those aspects, we'll have some great recommendations that come from the AI saying, hey, you know what? There's 500 different shafts you could use, but here are the 3 based on the way that you move and the way that things are working that AI is suggesting. All right, let's try those 3. So that aspect of it is really exciting to be able to marry the equipment up with obviously the physical. So I think we're going to see more of that as time goes by, and advanced modeling with 3D modeling of the club. Most of the models that exist right now are 2D or double pendulum models, right? And that's now going to be easy, if you will, for AI to kind of calculate 3D modeling and be able to actually maybe help coaches sort of design swings, if you will, for their students.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I've started using Sportsbox, just playing around with it, and it's pretty cool. Like I think for us instructors, we want stuff that saves us time. Right. And it's so quick to be able to capture a video and then put it into the app, and all of a sudden you get this amazing data.
Yeah, and if you're online like I am, 60% of my business is online. So, it's getting...
You're being able to measure like Sam Snead videos, Ben Hogan videos. Like, how cool is that?
Yeah, from 70 years ago. Yeah. And you're literally measuring in 3D what they did 70 years ago. I mean, the unbelievable stuff. Yeah. And then, what I really like about the company and where they're going is just that they're continuing to evolve the product, and they're trying to get it to the point where it's quite all encompassing, and you can take out of it what you want. Right. If you're just looking for body angles and things like that, you can get that. If you're looking at kinematic sequence data and wrist angles and things like that, you can also get that.
I like the hand path.
Yeah, hand path visuals really good. Are nice.
Yeah. The above view and the bottom, like view from the floor is really cool too.
Yeah, we call that up the Scottish view. Up the kilt.
Up the kilt.
Yeah, up the kilt.
Love it. Yeah. So what's next for you? Well, I know you're evolving your certification. You're working on different patterns. Can you give us a glimpse into the next few years of what your doing and planning? Like, where are you heading?
Well, I think some of the areas of interest that I'm working on right now is rate of squaring, rate of overtaking, rate of lowering, kind of looking at how the club is in the final, let's say 3 or 4 feet to the golf ball. Mm-hmm. How are we using that? Can we capitalize on that? And looking at the relationships between hand speed and or lead arm speed and club speed. So those are some interesting things. I've got some interesting data and stuff like that I'm looking at. From a let's say a player perspective, though, I think it's almost the opposite. Trying to get more involved with players, perhaps building a certain brand of play. And I think that's important with especially aspiring tour players and so on, is that they really understand, hey, when I shoot 65, it's because I drove it great, or I putted great, or really understanding their game and getting into, let's say, performance enhancement, and saying, for you, the key metric is fairways hit, or whatever it happens to be. Hit all the fairways, and now you're hitting it closer to the green, or closer to the pin. On your approaches, and that might be a key metric for some players. Or the bomber is often going to be proximity difficult short game shots is kind of one of the main correlators for success as a bomber player, because you're gaining obviously off the tee and you're down the fairway a lot further, but you're also shooting at more pins. So because you're shooting at more pins, the misses become more severe. When you do miss, you've got these difficult short-sighted shots, right?
Sure.
So if you're no good at those, you've now given up all the advantage that you've made down that hole.
Yeah.
So if you can be good at those shots, that kind of keeps the ball rolling and keeps the momentum. So the second most important stat for the bomber is 6 to 8 foot putts, because a lot of those short game shots, you're just not going to hit 2 feet from the hole. So you're going to be left with some sort of a tickler par putt. And again, if you're not that good in that range, now all of a sudden you've given up your advantage. So you're making 6 birdies a day, but you're also making 4 bogeys or whatever it happens to be.
Right. Yeah.
So looking at those kind of things and just helping players maybe design their brand a little bit, I think is kind of exciting to me. From there, getting more into trying to bridge the gap between the anecdotal and the evidence-based, and trying to say, okay, we're trying to get those players to feel something. Because, on the golf course, that's all you have, or your particular set of feels. So how can I put this in a language or a verbiage or a drill that's going to help reinforce those feels?
Yeah, I'm so curious. Like I get that question a lot from when I'm on the other side of the mic, is being able to conjure up whether it's an internal or an external cue for the player, right? Is it a club feel, is it a hand feel, or is it a body feel? Like those are always, I think, the decisions that are very difficult as coaches, and just being able to sort of probe that player, ask the right questions, get the correct feedback to know the direction you're going to go with that player to help them the quickest is what's always fascinating to me.
Yeah, and all relationships are different, right? That's the interesting thing is that we as coaches have to be better at communication skills, being able to read our players, perhaps even the nonverbal cues that you're getting in a lesson from their body language and the shrugged shoulders or the excitement or whatever it happens to be, and be able to read those things and say, okay, we might be onto something here, or hey, we're totally off base here,
right?
And we've got to readjust here.
Was that anything that you were aware of coming up through the ranks and giving so many lessons as far as the EQ versus the IQ? I always kind of dig into that question a little bit, whether it's a trained skill or is it purely environment awareness and experience. Like, what are your thoughts for young coaches right out there?
Yeah, when you want to build an environment, for sure. I'm a big believer you build the right environment. So the environment, if you're developing, let's say, great players, is you need a workspace that's going to be let's say safe. So you can take risks. You can try stuff, if you will, and see what sticks a little bit. So you need to have that workspace to be able to do that. Then if you're building these competitive players, you also need to build the competition end of it into it. So they need to be around like-minded players who are going to challenge them, maybe rip them a little bit. Maybe, you you have these little games and challenges and everything else. And part of developing tournament players is creating that environment where they can thrive. And I can't think of many places, when you have a hotbed, if you will, or creating that hotbed. I think that was in one of the books I read about, creating this hotbed of activity in certain areas. And regardless, obviously you need good coaching.
Yeah.
But it's also those external environmental things that have such a large part in whether that player goes on and does some amazing things, or if they just, they peter out or whatever.
Any books that you've come across in the last 10, 15 years
I think the one
that you've enjoyed, like
that might be is it Malcolm Gladwell's
that's the 10,000 hours one.
The 10,000 hours one. I think that was the one that the hotbed thing was.
I was thinking you're talking about Talent Code, maybe from Daniel.
Oh yeah, no, that's the one. That is the
one.
Where
he explored
the tennis and stuff.
Right.
Yeah. That is the one. Daniel Code.
That was a good one. Reading is becoming so like on the back, like
who reads anymore?
Nobody reads, right? It's all video or you're like audio booking it,
right?
Or podcast. Hopefully, everybody listens to this podcast because I think it's brilliant. But I mean, yeah, it's replaced almost reading books.
Well, I think when you look at historically, everybody has certain people in their life that they are either being mentored from, or they learn an older brother type scenario or somebody that's going to show them the ropes. And I think that every success story to a large extent starts with that. And I think so. Part of getting younger players to succeed and do great things is about being positive, being a positive influence, and giving them a place that they can work on their craft. And I know very early with Mackenzie Hughes, like I would give him a drill. I wouldn't see him for a week. He'd come back to my competitive program a week later, and I knew he was working on that drill every single day. And his discipline, his commitment to improvements are the reason he's on the PGA Tour.
There's no question. I've had him on the podcast, right?
Yeah.
And I've spent time with him, as you know, like from the other side, putting a little bit. But just talking to him, watching how he prepares. And I'm sure you've been a great influence working with him for so many years, but he just like checks all the boxes, right? It's like he does
the little things.
He does the little things. Yeah, it's nutrition, it's the sleep, it's the I know a lot from the national team that he took from
Derek Ingram.
From Derek, like he just seems to get the most out of his abilities. I always tell the story when people ask me, like, what's the difference between just average golfers or even scratch golfers and tour players? I'm like, the first time I met Mackenzie, I gave him the rope drill, the Black Mamba drill. I said, just draw. We were working on putting. And I said, just draw out what you see.
Yeah.
Okay? Like it was a 15, 20-foot putt, like with a rope. It took him 20 minutes to do it. Like, think about that. Like the amount of detail that he put into like a medial exercise that most people would be like, just throw it out there. Like, that's kind of what I was, what I mean? Yeah. It was just, and that showed me so much about how he conducts his business and conducts his life. That's why he's great.
Yeah, just processes really well. And
unbelievable.
Absolutely. And he's done that from a very early age. And, there's a self-drive there where he's very, very, there's an internal fire there, if you will.
Sure.
And he's never lacked that. He's never lacked the discipline. He's never lacked the commitment level to what he's tried to do. And he's done all the little stupid things that people just say, they don't want to do. I don't need to foam roll every day.
Right.
Well, Mackenzie foam rolls every day.
Yeah. It's crazy.
He does all those things well. And that's really, one of the primary reasons, because he, outworks a lot of guys out there. And, he's obviously made a great career for himself out there by doing so, and had some successes. So, I think it's when you're in that developmental mode that you're able to, inspire players, obviously teach them hopefully a few things, but also I think the real thing is also getting them to take ownership in their own future.
Absolutely.
And saying, hey, you don't really need me all the time. These days I don't have to talk to Mackenzie, a lot to know how he's doing. I mean, he knows what I'm going to say. I'll get a call every once in a while when he's struggling, but he doesn't need me day in and day out.
Right.
And to a point, we're kind of teaching ourselves out of a job, I guess, I think
it's a huge, I think that's kind of where we want to go. Like obviously it's not a good business model, but it shows, it reflects your brilliance and like your relationship that you've built with him and allowing him to take ownership of his game.
Well, and I think that's what the best players do. And,
100%.
And I think, you think of all those Tiger interviews and stuff, and he's like, yeah, I'm close. And, Tiger, you played really poorly, but I'm close, and when I get it, I got it.
Unbelievable.
Right? And just the confidence that going through the process, he knew that he was going to get there eventually. He just didn't have a timeline.
Unbelievable learner, right? I mean, we talked about that earlier. It's just like, how do you develop that mindset of understanding patience and how difficult this game is? I'm speaking to like the average golfers now, right? It's like, I'm not sure it's hard to instill that in somebody that wants, we're in the microwave world, right? The Kardashian world. Yeah. One lesson should fix me.
Yeah.
No. Like, you're the one that encouraged me to go super long term in my programs, the unlimited stuff. And there's no secret why the more time I spend with players, the better they get, right? It's just the way it works. So I think it's just nobody got good in this game without hitting an awful lot of balls at some point in their career. Right.
And there's no bypassing that, because like we talked about today, that's low point refinement, and the tighter we keep that low point value, the more consistent the face angle and blah blah blah. So we need a certain level of practice just to maintain what we have, let alone actually improve it.
Yeah.
And like you said, I think there's just, the players that love practice, the players that enjoy the process, enjoy the journey, those are the ones that are going to get the most out of the game. The ones that are saying, hey, I'll work on this for one weekend and then I'm done.
Yeah, if it doesn't work, then it's like it's not worth it, or, they get that attitude. So
they're doomed to fail, right?
Exactly. Cool, man. So anything I haven't asked you, or any topics that you would like to cover before we wrap? I so appreciate the time we've spent together, and it's so valuable to me, and I know it's going to help a lot of people out there and a lot of coaches. So,
well, certainly, obviously I enjoy talking to you. It's always fun to hear what you're up to and everything else, and the coaches in Carolina here, that some of them I knew online, had done the online certification.
Yep.
And, I met face to face today, which was great. So it's always a treat there, and I'm just like anybody else. I'm trying to get better at my craft. I'm trying to get better as a player. I'm trying to get better as a coach. And thankfully, for whatever reason, people like to listen to some of the stuff I say. So I'm blessed for that, for sure.
Absolutely. Luck is not the reason. Trust me. You've done the work, and I know how much time you've put into it, and we all appreciate your efforts. And like I said, I'll continue to promote you as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, certification and information of golf instruction out there. So tell us tell the listeners how they can get a hold of you, how they can sign up for certifications. What do you got coming down the pipe?
Yeah, so we're going to go back online in March. I'll have I'll have level 1 concepts again, I think on March the 20th. Anybody can reach out to me on Instagram. That's the easiest sort of forum to find me on. We've got ground reaction forces with Steve Furlonger.
What's the handle?
Scott Cowx certified.
Yeah.
On Instagram. Yeah. And we got ground reaction forces with Lee Cowx, who does a lot of stuff with Joe Miller and Martin Borgmeyer and some of these guys, and Steve Furlonger. That's going to be March 27th. And these are all online Zoom classes. So those are coming up. I've got some exciting stuff. Hopefully later in the year, I'm going to have Ian Fraser at TXG. He's going to do a club fitting module with me, and Phil Kenyon's going to do putting. So it'll be kind of fun to see their perspective on some of their approaches on some of that. And that's kind of one of the nice things about having done the certifications is now having some people that I really listen to in terms of their information and so on, and saying, hey, let's get some perspective on strategy and psychology, or club fitting, or putting, or short game, or whatever happens to be. And so it's been a lot of fun, and it's been fun to grow the brand, if you will. And
yeah.
Again, we're around 2,230 or so instructors worldwide have gone through it now. So
yeah, so cool. Glad to be one of those. And
well, you're multi-certified.
Well, yeah. under the table.
Under the table.
Like low-key redneck certified. People don't realize. But, yeah, and we're hopefully going to have certification down at Carlton River here maybe in the fall. We'll get that scheduled, get ahead of your busy schedule and make that happen. So coaches, I've already told coaches in that area, and then we'll get people coming from all over the country to do that. So
we'll do
keep promoting it.
Yeah, we'll do a big one here, and that'll be a lot of fun. To go visit your great place down in Hilton Head, and I mean the in-person ones I think are the best.
Absolutely, just
because we get the practical aspect out of it. But if you can't see me in person, then certainly the onlines. There's an awful lot of information that we'll go through and be able to process, and basically my take on things. And some people are going to agree and with a lot of it, and some people maybe not so much, and that's okay. Having those preferences, and just this is kind of me presenting the information and saying this is what you could do. Doesn't mean you have to, but you could do it this way.
Here are the options.
Here's options, exactly.
Thank you so much, my friend.
All right, pal. Thanks a lot.
You got it. What's up, everyone? Guru back here again with a couple of things before you jump off. First, big thank you to Scott for coming back on the show and for hanging out with me for a couple of days, which was super cool. And we got to have some really good discussions that probably didn't show up on the podcast, but probably would have been entertaining. And for sharing his story and his incredible knowledge, which we all enjoy and we're all going to get better by. Make sure you follow Scott on the gram and on Twitter at Scott Cowx Certified, and give him a social wave. Tell him thank you for coming on the show. Shoot him some questions. I know he'd appreciate that. Thank you again for all the sponsors, nvtohemp.com and Swing U. Make sure you use the promo code GURU20 for a 20% discount for life when you go to NV to Hemp and get your CBD products, which I love very, very much. And then make sure you go to my go to the App Store and get the Golf Guru app. Download the Golf Guru app. I appreciate that for the support and the love. And then give me a follow on Twitter and Instagram at Golf Guru TV. It's Golf Guru TV. And if you have any questions or comments for the show, you're welcome to email the show at golfgurushow@gmail.com or hit me up on the DM. Music was brought to you by Kevin MacLeod and Zach Mullet. And as I always leave you with, RIP Mr. Rohn, study, practice, teach, and then pass it on. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you next time.